Come back to your seats. Please, hope you got something good to eat. Thank you so much. I want to say thanks to Jeff for that excellent presentation, and also thanks to Ellen, who's not here today, but for her wonderful work and leadership over the years. Also, thank you to you. Look at what a full house we have. It's really exciting that you're all here in person. We're glad to get to interact and chat and see each other live. It always makes me feel really great. Now we get to come to the fun part of our panel presentation, and afterward you'll get to ask us questions. So I'm very delighted to introduce this distinguished panel today to talk about California's water challenges and opportunities. I'm just going to give a really brief introduction on each panelist, but you can find more information on them on the program, on your tables, or on our website. So next to me I have Phoenix Armenta. I have to read her title, it is long. She is the Senior Manager for Climate Equity and Community Engagement at the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission. And Phoenix has worked to operationalize equity and environmental justice across BCDC, but I will say from my previous life working in the Bay Area, she's a huge leader in community-driven planning, especially for sea level rise. And next we have Alvar Escriva-Bou. I always wonder if it's Bo, but it's Boo, right? It's Bo. Alvar Escriva-Bou, assistant professor at UC Davis, not UCLA, so he's back up here. You probably know Alvar from his many years as a senior fellow at PPIC and a real key player in some of our important products. He's an engineer and an expert on California agriculture. And next we have Karla Nemeth, the director of the California Department of Water Resources, a huge leader in water for the state, of course, and she likely needs no introduction for most of you in this room. And finally, we have Willie Whittlesey, the general manager of the Yuba Water Agency. Willie's passionate about accelerating the pace and scale of forest management to protect the Yuba watershed, which has a lot to do with water. And I'll say here again, we have someone who's a huge leader in that area, pushing things forward into an innovative space. So now we're going to go into the thought experiment that Jeff was talking about earlier, okay? It's suddenly 2050. It's so exciting. We're all driving electric cars and our stuff is getting delivered by drone, and it's amazing. All right, so now that it's the 35th annual Water Policy Fall Conference, this is approximately the 10th, it's going to be the 35th. And we've gathered to celebrate the extraordinary progress we've made across the state in managing our drought to flood climate. I'm going to present our panelists with a series of headlines from the year 2050, and they're going to help us understand what we did to get to the great place that we're in. All right, so we're going to start out with this article in the New York Times. This is a great article, How California Faced Climate Whiplash and Thrived. This is so awesome. It's been 25 years since we signed the Floodplains Forward MOU, said Karla Nemeth, water czar emerita. I guess time goes by, to a crowd at last week's Floods for Life Festival in Sacramento. Today, floods are part of our water supply and ecosystem restoration portfolio rather than just a threat. And our communities are much safer even though floods are getting larger. So Karla, tell us a little about this momentous moment and how did it happen? How did
that happen? Well, if you don't mind, first I would just like to acknowledge we have a whole table of McClatchy High School students here. And since we're talking about the future, they are the future. So it's great to have you all listening to this discussion. So, lots of things brought us to this moment of success. I'm just going to rattle off, I think, a whole series of things that I think also reflect the challenges that we've had most recently. So one, I would say that most watersheds in California have essentially a water master that is working on surface water supplies and helping communities understand how they manage those supplies when it's wet and when it's dry, because that enables local communities to take a more significant leadership role in how they manage supplies and work to get floodwaters underground. So that's thing one. I think we have finally mastered, if you will, regional permitting. So we have our state and federal agencies across the board all in alignment and working together in real time to get projects that we need, flood and habitat restoration and water supply projects implemented. At this moment in time, in 2050, we have a lot more transparency around data and information, and a big part of that has been using artificial intelligence to look at all kinds of work that we do in environmental permitting and make that information available to the public so that we significantly streamline, at least with state agency-sponsored environmental documents. We're not redoing and redoing and redoing, so we've mastered some pretty awesome efficiencies, harnessing that potential. We have pulled folks together and figured out the rehabilitation of significant pieces of infrastructure in California, including the State Water Project, but also the Central Valley Project. And we have come together as a state to deal with a pretty atrocious tragedy of the commons, which is subsidence, which is has severely hampered our flood control systems and our water delivery systems. So we have both state and federal funding that have addressed that multi-billion-dollar problem, together with water users and other local agencies that benefit from that. We also have a flexible water market, so we are transferring water to places where it's needed in a known way, in a transparent way, such that it's available and open to the public, the way in which California moves water to get it from where it's needed, or from where it is to where it's needed in any four corners of the state. So those are a smattering of things that are happening in that 2050 context. Maybe lastly, I'll say all water planning in the state of California is done at a watershed scale, meaning headwaters, floodplains, out to the ocean. And then lastly, maybe Letitia, which isn't quite responsive to your question, and I don't know where Jeff is, but I spend an insane amount of time thinking about flood risk. It's one of the things that absolutely keeps me up at night. So, and our poor state climatologist gets a lot of texts from me on a Saturday, which is, I say, don't respond, I just don't want to forget. You can respond on Monday. He gets a lot of texts, and my most recent text to him was, how does what's happening in Valencia, Spain, manifest in California? And what he told me without hesitation, this is 120 hours of an atmospheric river with a freezing elevation of 11,000 feet. So there's lots of us who are thinking about flood in real time, about what constitutes a catastrophe given climate change, and we have a lot of work to do. And it is my sincere hope that in 2050, we can say that we have not had significant fatalities from a flood emergency in the previous 2 decades. Unfortunately, I think to wake us up as Californians, we're going to have something that is more catastrophic than we are comfortable with or would like to admit before we do something significant to get us on the right track with flood.
Thank you. Thanks for the honesty on the flooding. Hopefully we can even exceed that goal. We had our wake-up call in 2023, so maybe we can be reminded that that was a gentle nudge in the right direction. Anyone else want to jump in on this? Alvar?
I just want to jump in, and I'm sorry for not being in 2050. I'll get back to 2050. I'm from Valencia, Spain, so it's difficult for me not to talk about that. And this is related. I just want to try to bring the discussion to positive terms in terms of planning, management of flood damages. But for those of you that don't know that, more than 200 people passed away last week just because of catastrophic flood. not well-organized emergency response. But in terms of what can we learn from that, and I think it's really important, and what you were mentioning and what Jeff was pointing out earlier. So the natural event that happened according to what we call stationary hydrology, which is what we've seen in the past. That's an event that the likelihood of happening is once every more than 2,000 years. The reality is that that's not, because now we have climate change. So what we have realized with that and what we are going to see is that more and more of that happening. And it's not a super likely event. What 30 inches in one day, when usually it rains only 20 inches in the whole year. So in some places, 30 inches in one day. We had floods that was associated with more than 1,000 years of periodic return, once every 1,000 years. But the thing is that we are not gonna, so first, what can we learn? We have to update our calculations considering non-stationary hydrology, what means we have to account for climate change. We have a lot of papers already telling us that risks are changing, and we are more risky today than we were 50 years ago or 20 years ago. And in 10 years, our risk is gonna increase a lot. So we have to plan for these risks, not for the risk of the past. And the second thing is that even if we plan for that, we can't avoid that. There are natural hazards that are going to happen. So what we have, one thing that we have to learn from the Valencia episode is that we have to manage human responses. We have to be ready for that to happen. We have to assess vulnerability in where population is, where our economic assets are, and also environmental issues. But manage these risks, minimize the potential human damages and economic damages. And I think it's really important to look at vulnerabilities and do good mapping and do good planning, and also managing the emergencies is really important to understand that we're going to have emergencies and we have to be quick in responding. Yeah. Sorry for bringing you down, but that's the reality. And we have to getting back to 2050. That's what I was thinking to respond to this point, is that it's really important to update we did well in 2025 by updating our climate change risks by considering non-static or non-stationary hydrology. And then we did good emergency response plans for all these flood potential damages that we would have.
Right, and I think as we read these articles from the rest of the world and also from the rest of the US, those kinds of flooding events can happen here. And if we could learn from them instead of experiencing them and then learning from them, it would be really great. Phoenix has something to add.
Yeah, I really wanted to emphasize the importance of having educated and engaged community members in the development of this MOU. I worked with the great Miss Margaret Gordon of the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, who always emphasized that what we needed was education and orientation for our community members to include them in this process. So that's why at BCDC, with our Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan, we're actually co-developing our plan with community members and launching a series of shoreline leadership academies to get community members involved in the planning process. With our Shoreline Leadership Academies, we're providing the education and then we orient community members to start working with their local governments to design for flooding in a way that works best for that particular community. In this way, we create a circular learning environment where government provides the best available science and community members advise them on how to best implement that science. That's how we ended up with the best outcomes for dealing with flooding.
Yeah, thank you. I think if people knew what the risk was of flooding where they live, they might be more engaged in the way Phoenix is talking about. Do you want to add anything, Willie, before we move on?
I have a lot to add, but I'll just add a little fun anecdote instead of getting into the weeds and talk about the serious stuff. It'll just be, I think, as it relates to climate change, I find that I have to catch myself sometimes. And I'll give you an example. It happened to me yesterday. Every year we have to do an annual emergency EAP, emergency action plan related to our FERC license for our hydroelectric project. And ours just happened to be yesterday, and I happened to be in the control room just visiting the team. I go up there a couple times a year, and it was going on, and I was overhearing the simulation, the drill, and it was a major atmospheric river, and getting to the flood impact here in May of some given year. And I thought to myself, that could never happen. Our floods and our atmospheric rivers are in January and February, and we had major impacts in Yuba County in '86 and 1997. And I was about to jump in and go, you guys, is this really a plausible thing? And I just sat back and go, catch yourself. Anything is possible. And I'll give you kind of a parallel here. The campfire in 2018 was November 8th. And I am a forester, and I've studied forestry. And if you would have asked me 25 years ago if we'd have a significant catastrophic wildfire in November of any given year, I would just say no way in heck. Yeah. But it happened, and it was one of the most devastating wildfires we've ever seen. So that's the wildfire sign of climate change. Who am I to say to my team who's putting together a simulation that we're not going to have a flood in May? So it's just, anything can happen. We need to be prepared for it. I will, like Karla, I don't know where Jeff is. I'll challenge Jeff. I love his reality where he just says, we got to plan for this, and we've got to, all this stuff's happening, and no one's doing it. And I sit back and go, Jeff, man, that's all I do all day is think about the next flood and how do we protect these people and all that. So anyway. Some of us are thinking about it, Jeff, but thanks for the challenge.
Water control manuals will be updated.
That's right. We're working on it right now.
Core reservoir, because we will be all in on forecast-informed reservoir operations, and that's going to help a May situation.
Exactly.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you for that happy point. Okay, we're going to move on to our next headline. This is in the LA Times. Remember, we're still in 2050. California's frontline communities become climate leaders on the international stage. The California Association of Frontline Communities is now fielding teams to advise governments throughout the US and internationally on how to structure equitable climate adaptation programs in the face of climate change. The group rose to prominence in the 2030s for its innovative approach to building unlikely coalitions and advancing multi-benefit projects all over the state of California. So Phoenix is going to tell us, how did this come about?
Well, it's really interesting how the election of Donald Trump to the presidency in 2024 really galvanized the movement. The California Association of Frontline Communities was really born from the response to some of the draconian attempts of the Trump administration to go after immigrants and reduce funding for climate change. As soon as he was elected, we started to organize. We identified where we had strengths and where we would have to fortify the movement. We had so many tools in place, but we really had to figure out how to scale them up in a resource-poor environment that was hostile to our movement. The original members of the California Association of Frontline Communities came from the graduates of the many climate justice training programs that were then blooming in California. The BCDC Shoreline Leadership Academies, the Mycelian Youth Network, the Indigenous Traditional Ecological Knowledge Academy, and many other programs trained members of frontline communities in the tools they needed to create solutions to the climate and social issues they were all facing. The graduates of those programs went on to build local projects to help their communities adapt to climate change, projects that were then scaled up to help the entire state and now the world. There are two projects from these early days that I want to highlight. The first is Neighborship by Adam Garrett Clark. Neighborship was one of the founding members of the California Association of Frontline Communities. Born out of the Oakland Shoreline Leadership Academy, Neighborship taught residents how to use plants and mushrooms to remediate toxic sites in their community. They launched a pilot program in West Oakland in 2025 with over 100 residents participating. Through their innovative approach to grassroots bioremediation, they helped spread the knowledge of how to address contamination in communities across California, which led to the cleanup of 75% of all toxic sites in brownfields in California by 2045. The second project I'd like to highlight is Ninth Route by Shai Walker. Shai developed meditative shoreline spaces that use nature-based solutions and community input to address sea level rise while incorporating public access into shoreline rehabilitation. Ninth Route created a shoreline rehabilitation model that could be reformed and utilized on a variety of shorelines with community at the lead of design. The project became a model for how to do sea level rise planning in a regenerative and community-driven manner. The founder of these projects started to realize they needed a statewide network to build upon their lessons learned. Scaling projects like these were one of the first goals of the California Association of Frontline Communities. The early members realized that without federal funding and support, they had to come up with creative ways to expand these ideas. They started forming coalitions to help to build up the individual organizations. They came up with creative funding models that utilized grassroots fundings for projects. They focused on turning their projects into worker and community-owned cooperatives and figured out ways to raise revenue from the people they were working with. The traditional for-profit business models were no longer working for us, and we needed to band together as a community to face down the corporations that were trying to take over everything. Because California was a sanctuary state, we saw an influx of immigrants, people of color, gay and transgendered folks, and climate refugees come into our state. For a while, our homeless population soared, until the California rent strike of 2028, where 250,000 unhoused residents took over unoccupied apartment and office buildings, and 10 million California residents refused to pay their rent for 2 whole years. They finally forced outside investors to give up their properties and sell them back to the residents who lived in them for reasonable rates. The preceding land back movement ended up housing all of our unhoused and put 30% of California land into the hands of its indigenous people. That is probably why we saw the election of the first indigenous Two-Spirit woman as governor of California in 2034. She was a prominent leader in the rent strike and was able to win the governor's seat through the California Association of Frontline Communities' unique grassroots funding model and supporting their platform of land back, climate justice, and economic empowerment for the poor. Since we had been suffering through an economic depression for several years and the value of the dollar had completely depleted, she worked closely with the California Association of Frontline Communities to develop a California alternative currency. The California Carbon Care Currency, or 4Cs, generated value from carbon sequestration and care activities and was circulated through the worker-owned cooperatives. With this currency, you could actually make money from doing things like planting trees, growing a garden, or caring for elders. Instead of the traditional model of exploitation and extraction generating wealth, the 4Cs generated wealth through doing good in the community. Members of the California Association for Frontline Communities had the idea to create statewide contests to help jumpstart the currency. One contest was to see who could plant the most trees across California, and that led to the great tree rush of the 2030s. For every tree planted and cared for, participants got shares of the currency. Soon, cities like LA and Oakland became lush urban forests, leading to the cleaning of the air in those communities. Folks could get paid for planting and maintaining trees, and a new generation of wealth started to bloom, a wealth that was based on building up community. There were other contests, like the one to grow food in urban settings. Soon, school kids were growing vegetables off the sides of apartment buildings, and every household had some kind of garden. California grew so much food locally that cities started to become self-sustaining in their food production. Through the 4Cs, the California Association of Frontline Communities developed wealth from climate mitigation, so an entire generation started working on climate issues. Soon, working on climate change issues became more popular and more lucrative than working in the fossil fuel industry, and the people who worked in these industries became folk heroes to the community. Their success in creating circular economies that perpetuated climate resiliency is what led them to be sought after by agents around the world for their expertise and advice.
Okay, wow. So is that all, Phoenix?
just a couple of things that happened.
Just a couple of small changes. Well, I think you can see why Phoenix is up here. She has so much vision. I just want to acknowledge there were some things that haven't happened yet in that vision, looking backward from 2050, but there was also some real names and real projects from the Oakland Shoreline Leadership Academy. So it's not all fiction. It's a great, wonderful vision. And no matter who's in the White House or running the country, it is important to have communities engaged in having that self-determination and how we adapt to climate change. Anyone else want to follow up on that?
I do want to think about, and Jeff mentioned it in his presentation, which is great, just the enormous improvements we've had in water use efficiency and reduction in demand. But when we start thinking about 2050, we also need to be thinking about, one, it's hotter, so everything requires more water. Even your drought-tolerant landscape requires more water. But we also need to be thinking about, I do believe there will be movement of people from places where the threats are too big or there's been an emergency, and we will have significant numbers of folks that become climate refugees. And I think even in other parts of the Western United States, when we really start to look at how are we going to deal with things like the Colorado River, and drying conditions westwide, I do think we need to be ready for influxes of more people in California. It's not the story right now. We are, losing people. I don't know where we are exactly now. I know it's dropped off. You may know that. But I think as a general matter, when we look out several decades, I think California's loss of population is but a temporary moment.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I just wanted to add and bring into, to most of the work that I do is related with groundwater and the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. If I think in 2050, I think that the state Karla's department, the Department of Water Resources, and the State Control Board both did a great job on setting the rules and reviewing the plans to actually improve them. And one of the points on the frontline communities was that actually many plans and that many researchers, like I have colleagues like Christine Dobbin or Linda Stelly, that highlighted that communities were not being, in the beginning of the development of the plans and the implementation of the plans, communities are not being represented. And that the state actually that put that in the review of the plans. And we changed that. And the plans and the implementation of the plans actually accounted for all parties that are affected by groundwater management. So I think that the communities had a really important role on this.
Absolutely. You want to talk about communities in the mountains a little bit, Willie?
Yeah, that's where I was going to go, actually. So Karla mentioned climate refugees or the movement of people, and we're going to see that. And I think she's referring to California and kind of people moving out of California as a trend the last few years. But then at some point, people will be moving into California. But I'm just going to talk about kind of more of a micro situation that's actually occurring. You look at, I'm going to go, sorry, I hate to do it, but I'll go back to the Camp Fire. The Camp Fire impacted an entire community of Paradise, and those folks needed a place to live. If you went to Chico in the winter of 2018-19, Chico is a totally different place. I live in Marysville, about 45 minutes south of Paradise. It was a totally different place. You couldn't find a place to live. I'm trying to hire employees and get employees into the area, and it's difficult because there's just nowhere to go, and that's temporary. Paradise is going to rebuild. It's rebuilding now, but it's a climate impact to where people live and their daily lives. But that's a big community. People may not know that, but Paradise is a fairly big community. It's going to be rebuilt. Contrast that with a little community called Greenville, which burned almost completely every structure in Greenville in the Dixie Fire just a few years later. I don't know that Greenville is sustainable in the future. I'm sure if there are folks in here that know people in Greenville, I'm not totally versed on this, but it's a different community. It's very small, and I don't know that it's going to be able to be rebuilt like it was before. And where are those people going to live, and those families that have lived in that area for generations? And in fact, I have an employee that was born and raised in Greenville. So at any rate, those are like the forest-related or mountain-related impacts that are happening now. Look, I'll relate it to flooding a little bit too. Entire communities were devastated by Hurricane Helene a few weeks or a month or so ago. I mean, I can't imagine where people are going. And again, these are just the micro situations. They're devastating, but where are people going? And is it going to be temporary? Is it going to be long-term? And how does that shift us around? And I guess my point here is bringing up real impacts of climate change that I've seen just in the last several years and we've witnessed. So it's here. It's like Jeff said, it's not a point in time. It's not, okay, climate change is here. The clock starts now. We told you it was coming, and now here's the impacts. They're happening. These fires, these hurricanes, floods, they're occurring now.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this movement of people is a great point. And the thing we have to remember with most climate change impacts is they're not linear. They're here now, but they're going to accelerate. And so our preparation has to accelerate with them. And we really do have to use these examples as our wake-up calls and our learning opportunities. Okay, back to 2050. So our next headline comes from the Wall Street Journal, and our economists love it when there's a California water article in the Wall Street Journal. We woke up and we're excited to see the San Joaquin Valley grower wins coveted Mez California Award. Someone's laughing. Thank you. Oh, it's Karen. Thank you, Karen. In a coup for San Joaquin Valley growers, Wolf Farming and Processing was awarded the 2050 Mez California Award for agave-based spirits. The company is part of a consortium of growers who embraced innovations in low water cropping in the 2020s and are now producing world-renowned agave spirits as well as other numerous crops with a fraction of the water once used. Stuart and Lisa Wolf helped jumpstart the industry with their jointly endowed UC Davis Agave Center in 2024. So another little bit of fact in the fiction. So Alvar, do you want to tell us a little bit about how this happened?
This is a really interesting story. So, so actually, I know the people that actually started the center in Davis, and I used to work there. I actually don't know where I work now. So, no, but So the thing is that putting this in the broader context, there were a lot of initiatives like this in that time. The thing is that we actually understood, and that was a big point, and broadening the scope, we understood that the best way to protect agriculture and our communities was to scale down a little bit on water use. And actually, Jeff was pointing out, and Karen is here, yeah, I can tell you that today in 2050, we are the first state in the nation in agricultural production, and we are still our agricultural leader in the whole world. So just by scaling down water use a little bit, we actually can increase our resilience. And we can be more productive and have more secure sources of water. But how we did that? This reduction in water use opened a window of opportunity. There was a lot of initiatives like the limited water crops, like agave and other crops. But there were many others. We can talk about solar. We can talk about habitat restoration. There were also new land developments, groundwater recharge basins. There were many opportunities, and all people in California, given this need to actually reduce or scale down a little bit on water use, we had to think about how to repurpose lands, right? But I'll want to bring 3 points. I think that are the most important points. And in this first one, I'm not going to be really innovative, but the first thing, what set the rules, was good groundwater planning and good groundwater management. We actually learned early on, and I can acknowledge our old friend Aaron Fukuda, that people that put groundwater allocations, they actually learned that they paid off because they set the incentives right to the farmers. The farmers knew their groundwater budget, and they actually needed have incentives to recharge more water and to make plans for planting decisions in the future. We also, and this is the first thing, groundwater planning and management, and we had to plan for variability also. Droughts are going to happen. We know that they happened. So the 2027-2030 drought was really bad, and that actually helped us incentivizing all these actions. So first thing is groundwater planning and management. Second thing, it's smart land repurposing. And there were a lot of ideas. This is one of the ideas, the limited crops, but there was also solar, as I was mentioning, recharge opportunities or habitat restoration. I think that the most important thing here is to be smart on our initiatives and in our investments. There was a lot of really cheap options, actually almost zero money. There's a lot of people kind of ready to put solar farms because this is a good business. There was a good business in 2024. So we should take advantage of these kind of initiatives and try to align this energy with the water policies to actually put this solar in farms. Of course, being smart, being scalable, that respect communities. And the same for water limited crops with small incentives, with a few $100 per acre maybe. We can actually make the change or make the incentive right for farmers to actually switch to other kind of crops that use less water. And then if we can actually trade water, I was talking to my colleague Josh Beers earlier, we have the opportunities to scale down or to potentially use less water on alfalfa, still produce alfalfa, but maybe put that water on the market, that water on the market to get more money. So there are some incentives that are actually really cheap, almost $0 cost. And then there's other opportunities where we have to think about what are the public benefits of other land uses, for example, for communities or for environmental benefits. So when we actually can do serious cost-benefit analysis and we can actually use our public money to pay for these initiatives, I think that we should do it actually to incentivize these changes in land uses. But actually, we're in 2050 now, and we have 500 acres that were transitioned from ag to other uses, to solar, to recharge, to other uses. And we are still, as I was saying, the first state in the nation in agriculture. The last thing, just the last point, it's really important, it was really important to think about a regional approach. Still in 24, we were doing a lot of pilot studies that were really helpful. But the San Joaquin Valley is diverse. We have a really different conditions in the wetter or wettish north than the drier south. So we have to look at regional approaches, do investments that are smart. For example, solar transmission is a really bottleneck, but we can talk also about, water infrastructure, canals, conveying infrastructure, and again, also thinking about water markets. There's a lot of need of water in the south, and there's more water in the north, and we actually can make things more equitable by sharing some water and don't allow some counties to just reduce 50, 75% of their water use because there's not a lot. So these 3 points, groundwater planning and management, the second, smart land repurposing, and the third, regionalization of these approaches. So these are the most important things that we did.
All right, great. There's our roadmap. Anyone else want to talk about agriculture successes in 2050?
I have some thoughts.
I'd love to hear it.
So let's see, what did Jeff say earlier? Something like, Jay Lund said, climate change, there's something in it for everyone, something like that? Okay. So when you think about groundwater recharge, I think there's huge opportunities there. I think for water management, there's not one solution. I mean, we're gonna have to pull on every different solution, different ways to manage surface water, but groundwater recharge is definitely one of the tools to get to sustainability in the future, in a future with climate change. And I'll just remind everyone that the studies we're seeing is the overall precipitation, at least in the Sierras where I operate and work, the overall precipitation is not going to change, but the form of precipitation is going to change, and there's going to be less snow. And I think there was a slide earlier. There's less snow, therefore less snowpack. But the floods, and we also operate in a flood world, the floods are going to be more severe. And so, whether you're in a flood situation and you're trying to protect people, or you're just in a high flow year where there's ample water and there's opportunity there. There's something in it for everyone. There's opportunity there to recharge the groundwater, and we just need to be smart about that. And I think Karla mentioned things like, managing on a watershed basis. Watershed includes, like she said, the headwaters all the way down to, the floodplains and out into the delta. And part of that is the groundwater, and we need to be smart with our groundwater management, and huge opportunity there, even with climate change.
Absolutely. So lots of opportunity there with managing our flooding differently. Did you want to weigh in on that, Karla?
I would just add, we have successfully brought to the market and to scale work on brackish water desal that's focused on specific water quality that suits different crops. And through the partnership that we have with the Water Board and the Department of Water Resources and the labs, which are doing that pilot work now, we have identified everywhere that would be feasible and important to help stabilize water supplies, particularly in the valley.
Oh, that's wonderful news.
And then I don't know where this fits, but Department of Water Resources and the Water Board are using the same models to understand our system at a time step that helps us think about flood and helps us think about water supply.
That's wonderful. Phoenix?
I guess I just want to bring in the human element of it and say that, the treatment of agricultural workers is also a key component in this. Exploitation of land and exploitation of human beings often go hand in hand. And I think organizing that contingency, making sure that they're taken care of and that they're a part of this process is really important step.
Absolutely, and there's been some thinking about this already, thinking about can we retrain some farm workers to help install and run some of the utility scale solar that might go on in the valley. So there's definitely, back to Jay Lund again, there's definitely some opportunity here, hopefully, for people. All right, let's move on to our last headline. And this is in the Sacramento Bee, so it's a nice local story. The wildfire damages dropped to the lowest level in 3 decades. This year, despite a record number of hot, windy days, wildfire damages dropped to their lowest level in 3 decades in California. The state's robust, years-long investment in fire preparedness seems to be paying dividends as the number of severe wildfires and human ignitions fell precipitously. The change is good news for communities, human health, ecosystems, and the state's water supply infrastructure. And Willie's going to tell us how this happened.
Awesome, I shall. Let's see here. I first want to talk about the format we have going on here. Since I'm last, I got to see how it all unfolded, and I want to let you know, 5, 10 years ago, I started being asked to be on panels. And it used to be, you stood up in front of a podium and you had PowerPoint slides. And then people got to this panel scenario, which is way more comfortable and way more fun. But then I heard we're going to do this. It's 2050, and we're going to talk about it from a 2050 perspective. And that kind of, you can't really prepare for that, because we were told you're going to interact with the folks on, what happened in 2050. And I think this has gone really well, and it's super fun. So I just got to say, this is an awesome way to do a panel. Okay, so it's 2050, and we have a great headline about not much damage in the wildfire space. All right, so I'm 75 in 2050, and I don't have a great memory, but I'll ask Phoenix, who was elected governor in 2034?
Her name was Alicia Ongo.
Okay.
Yes, she was an indigenous Two-Spirit leader of the rent strike movement. Yeah.
Excellent. So we have an indigenous female governor in 2034. Awesome. And then you mentioned something about like a community ship or community something?
Neighborship.
Neighborship, thank you. Okay, so I think that fits into what happened in the forest management space and the wildland-urban interface. So I'm going to try and inject that here now that you've reminded me who was governor in 2034. So in 2034, we have an indigenous governor who basically pulls CAL FIRE and the Forest Service together and says, for 15 or 17 years, you all have had an agreement to treat 1 million acres a year, and you've only been treating X amount, let's say less than 1 million. We know you really want to, but a lot of things get in your way of budgets and permitting and all that stuff, but we really need to start doing this to improve our communities, and I think I have a way to help you. My indigenous people have been doing this for hundreds or thousands of years, and we have a lot of ideas. You've contacted us, we've given you ideas, but you haven't truly implemented them. So the Native folks are brought into the fold. The Native folks are now partnering, or this is like a tri-party agreement now with the Forest Service and CAL FIRE, and we're talking about managing on a watershed level our watersheds using Native American resources and tribal knowledge, in particular with how to use fire and prevent catastrophic fire by the use of fire. So also, other community folks are getting together. The fire safe councils are way more robust because people realize they have to work together on a community level. What is a watershed level? A watershed is a large community of a bunch of smaller communities. People need to get together at that level, and every watershed is different, so every management tool is going to be slightly different in every different watershed. So the fire safe councils are just much more powerful, more well-funded, and there's actually work getting done on the ground. So I think those are two main things that happen between now and 2050. But we talked about there was less human ignition. So let's go to that a little bit. Energy utilities got smart on how to manage their equipment. Okay, let's just say that way. And also how to operate their equipment. And they got really good at like smart grid technology and things like that, and burying lines where it makes sense to bury electrical lines. So we reduce the likelihood of an ignition. But we also heard that the fires were less severe, so we were more prepared. Well, more prepared isn't just having a fire safe council and communities and evacuation routes and communities are educated. It's also preparing the wildland-urban interface. Well, how do we do that? We have to have a community that's wise to what's going on, wise to the ecology and how wildfire has been in California for forever. California adapted with wildfire, and how that they can still live in these communities and be prepared for the threat of that wildfire that's not going away, but also treat your land or treat your properties such that if a fire occurs, it burns at a low intensity. It's not catastrophic, and we construct houses in smart ways, and the homes are now hardened. Existing homes are hardened, and new building materials are put in place that make our homes more resilient. Of course, we need to have your typical emergency action planning and evacuation routes and smart communities so that we can, if we do have a wildfire, get people out of their community safely. Those are some of the major I think events that go on between now and 2050 and cause us less impact. Then, of course, I'm going to talk about water, and let's talk about water. One thing in Yuba Water Agency's participation in watershed management and trying to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire is to protect the quality and quantity of water. And it's one thing we don't talk about that often is the impact of the quality of water just in the kind of the immediate winter time after a catastrophic wildfire. Unfortunately, there are major inputs of toxins into our water supplies, and we need to, anything we can do to decrease the severity of these wildfires will improve our water quality. And then there's water quantity, and that is, if we can get these forests to where they're resilient, where they actually burn, they're still vegetated, they're still beautiful, you can still recreate in them, but they are managed to a point where if they burn or when they burn in a low intensity. And what that does is that in forests that hadn't experienced catastrophic wildfire, the hydrologic cycle is maintained. You can have rain or snow, and that rain or snow in the wintertime in California percolates through the soil profile, makes its way to these little subterranean channels and pop out in little creeks and streams that make their way to the Feather or the Yuba and other rivers, and that natural cycle is maintained. In areas, watersheds that have been impacted by catastrophic wildfire, we restore our forests to a smart density, a density that's manageable such that we restore that hydrologic cycle. And I'll just say that many watersheds that experience this catastrophic fire, and what I mean by catastrophic fire is acres and acres and acres that every piece of live vegetation is now dead because the fire was so hot. It changes the soil chemistry, it changes the ability for water to percolate through the soil, water runs off quicker. It makes it difficult for water managers or reservoir managers because now we have, for several years afterward, not only do we have the sediment and debris input into our reservoirs, we have a more flashy watershed. Our watershed runs off much quicker. It doesn't last forever, but it is impactful, and it depends on what type of hydrology you have the following year on how tricky it is to manage. So water quality and water quantity are either maintained in a good condition or improved in areas where we've had catastrophic fire. Carbon sequestration is something that I don't know that gets a lot of attention when we talk about catastrophic wildfire, but all that smoke is carbon that's released in the atmosphere. And all the trees that are, if you drive up through the Sierras any time in the past several years, you've probably passed a wildfire area where there's standing dead trees. As those standing dead trees decompose, they're releasing carbon to the atmosphere. So when we get our forests, this 2050 state, they're more resilient, and they are actually growing and sequestering carbon in the forest, both in the above ground carbon, the trees that you see, and the below ground carbon in the soil and the roots. And if we can maintain that and it doesn't catastrophically burn, then it's sequestered long term. So there's that, and then there's air quality. We identify alternative uses for low value forest products. And I'm not talking about lumber or even plywood. That's high quality forest products that can be made into a building. We're talking about the limbs and needles and leaves and tops of trees and brush and forest waste. I have this dream that someone comes up with some type of product that's made out of this low value material, and it gets sent to the Amazon warehouses, and instead of packing your stuff with plastic stuff, they pack it with naturally created, something. Someone needs to invent this so that all of that is recyclable and all that stuff is, doesn't go to waste. So instead of using plastic. So anyway, somebody dreams up some really good alternative forest products where this waste can be used. And this waste is also used for energy. We do that now. We've actually been using forest waste for energy for over 100 years. It's a very low-tech way to utilize forest waste. We continue to do that, but we find even better products like renewable natural gas. We harness hydrogen somehow from these forest products, and we utilize syngas in some methodology there for energy, whether it's portable energy like a fuel cell, hydrogen fuel cell, or it's stagnant in-place energy like some type of syngas electricity generator. That technology is being worked on now, and by 2050, I hope that we would have harnessed it in a meaningful way at a scale where none of this material is being left in the forest, just burned in piles, or left in the forest to decompose. That's my vision of what happens in 2050.
I love that. It's the full circle look at what better management of our forests can do for us. It's not just water, but so many other things also. Anyone else want to jump in on there?
I have a question for Willie. So
Go
am I
for it.
working as a retired annuitant for Yuba?
Absolutely, Karla. That's
And,
right. We're both losing our memories together.
And what kind of scale is mountain meadow restoration happening in your watershed, and how does that play into it?
It does play into it. Absolutely is playing into it. Currently, I would say when you look at an opportunity to manage a forest on a watershed scale, you don't just look at the forest. You look at everything from ridgetop to ridgetop, because that's what a watershed is. And where meadows exist, you try to restore meadows to the condition that they were in. And that's, again, above ground vegetation. People don't realize that many of the forests you drive by, and let's say Interstate 80 or the Highway 50 corridor, and I'm sorry I focus on the Sierras, but that's where I live, that's where I come from, and that's what I know. So a lot of the forests you look at, many of them, they were meadows at one point in time. You might see a young stand of conifer trees and it's a beautiful forest, but it was actually a meadow 200 years ago. And the water hydrologic cycle dynamic has totally changed now that it's a forest and not a meadow. So we do need to restore our meadows. We need to restore both the above ground component that we see, and that will in turn restore the below ground component, as these meadows they're literally sponges for water. They're a reservoir out there. I tell people that we have many types of surface water reservoirs. We have the snowpack, and we have the soil profile, and then we actually have surface reservoirs like Karla and I manage. The soil profile in meadows is just it's a water bank. That's what it is. It's very similar to groundwater and well-managed groundwater basins in the valley. So yes, Karla, to answer your question, we're managing meadows opportunistically and restoring them to let's call it pre-1850 conditions.
I think I remember a headline from last week that said we used a lot of beavers to do that, and we got about 3 times the meadow acreage that we had in the year 2000. We got that back. So that was a great question. Anybody else want to jump in on headwaters management? Oh, what's that? Oh my goodness. We don't have cell phones anymore, we have brain implants. Oh, there's breaking news, it's in Maven's notebook. It turns out the salmon fishery is going to be open this year. Oh, this is so exciting. And it sounds like populations have recovered to the point where we can have commercial fisheries. There are huge numbers of fish that spawned last fall up at the headwaters of the Klamath. It's just such great news. I want to share this new headline with you guys and see if you have any comments or responses to how did we get here, since I think all the things that you talked about are components of that solution.
I mean, I think indigenous co-management of lands is such an important part of it. And, we're seeing it happening, or we saw it happen in 2024. And that's really when it started to scale up. We see like land back movements. For example, Oakland gave a bunch of land back to the Segorite Land Trust. I was trying to, something on the tip of my tongue about the opening up of, you know what I'm talking about? There was an opening of a dam recently.
Yeah, up at the Klamath.
At the Klamath, yeah, okay. So you all can speak to it more, but I really do think that it started in 2024 with that co-management of lands.
Thank you.
We've done a review of DWR's 1,200 jurisdictional dams. There are a lot of dams in California. And we went through a whole process of understanding which dams on which systems offered the best opportunity for restoration for salmon, and how to recalibrate either the hydro production or the water use. And we worked with tribal communities to get some of those dams removed in a very targeted way across the state, where we had the best opportunity to set conditions for salmon.
Great. And wasn't there something didn't you guys see something about using floodplains more effectively? Was that you, Willie? Or no, Karla?
I was just saying, it's a small thing. Do you want to start on floodplains?
Sure, I'll start on floodplains. I'll just say that we have altered the landscape throughout California big time since, let's call it the mid-1800s, and we realized we need to get this landscape back to a functional condition, and that includes managing the floodplain. So what happens between now and 2050 is, as part of our flood risk reduction design based on climate change, we look at opportunities to put levees in places where they make more sense, to open up more floodplain management, and we restore that habitat that used to be kind of on the dry side of the levee and is now on the wet side of the levee. We're working with folks like Jacob Katz and trying to get, let's call it enriched water, like biologically enriched water into the rivers instead of this, almost purified water that that doesn't spend its time in slow-moving backwaters and collecting biological materials such that there's food for salmon to feed on now and other critters. And so we use rice fields in a different way so that we can get some actual biological material in that water and get that process kick-started. And we just take advantage of every project we're looking at, whether it's an improved diversion on a river or a levee or flood project. How do we incorporate additional management of salmon habitat and salmon survival into those projects? And that's the way we need to start looking at these projects, whether it's fish passage or fish screening or just improved habitat. We're looking at those opportunities through a different lens.
Great. Did you want to add your small thing, Karla?
I would just add that we started at the bottom of the system and we worked our way up from a flood perspective. We engaged in public-private partnerships to do the work we need to do this kind of landscape scale restoration of floodplains. Those floodplains are connected to tens and tens of thousands of tidal marsh restoration in the Delta. We've learned from, we've had a few projects on the books for decades, and in the past 3 to 5 years, we've done, I mean, people in this room know Dutch Slough was on the books for a long time. McCormick-Williamson track on the books for a long time. We just started breaking ground on Prospect Island. I've got people at DWR who spent their whole careers on those projects. They're finally happening. So we've learned from all of that, and we've learned how to do it at scale and quicker, and to really make sure that we're connecting the system so that that how we think about taking care of salmon starts high in the watershed, all the way through with in-stream flows, onto those floodplains, out the Delta where they're slowing down, they're eating, they're getting through, they're hitting the ocean a little bit later at the right time. They're a little more resilient to ocean conditions, which are also changing, and they're coming back up through our system.
Can I ask a question to Karla? I wanted to add, in your first intervention, you mentioned that there will be, this is Jeff Mount asking.
Okay.
If it will be, there will be water masters for every basin.
Yes.
Would these water masters will be in charge of protecting environmental water budgets and through these basins?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Just.
Yay for watershed scale management. It's gonna be happening by 2050. All right, I want to thank the panel for that salmon question. A little bit of a curveball because it just came in over the airwaves, right?
Oh, wait, I got one over the airwaves.
Okay, we're going to move on to Q&A in a sec, though.
We were reminded it didn't take till 2050 to open the fishing season. It was
Yes.
It was open much quicker than that. Sorry, I just got that.
Yeah, no. Let's hope for 2030, maybe earlier, right? Maybe 2025. Okay, so audience, yay, it's time for your turn. It was really fun to get to chat with our panel, but now we get to talk with you. So for those of you in the room, raise your hand, and one of our staff members will bring a microphone to you. And remember, they're going to hold on to the mic. And for our folks joining us online, put your questions to the email address on the screen. Is it up there? ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And those will come through to us here at the stage. So before we turn to our first question, I want to welcome our special guests who are in the room today, who we already heard about a little bit from Karla. This is our high school, I think, AP Bio class from McClatchy High School, who are taking up 3 tables here. And among them is the daughter of Jennifer Pierre, who's a well-known leader in California water. So I think that happened just by chance. So welcome to Mira and all of her fellow students, and we'd like to turn to you for the first question. Wait, we're turning the mic on. Hold on a sec. Okay.
It's on? Yeah. Hi, I'm Mira Pierre. I'm so happy to be here. I'm with McClatchy High School, and all of us are so honored to be here, and thank you so much for having us. In regards to our question, so we know that water for farming is important, but we also find the ecosystem very important because the ecosystem contributes to sustainability of our levees and salmon populations, and we also know that runoff from farming is contributing to climate change by adding nitrogen to our delicate waterways. So because in order to preserve both entities, farming and the waterways, we need to balance providing water for farms as that is necessary whilst keeping the ecosystem safe and healthy. So what kind of legislation can be passed to regulate the sources of runoff from major farming that cause the pollution in our delicate river ecosystems?
Okay, great question. Thank you. Who wants to take that one? I'm looking at you, Karla, but
I couldn't quite hear the question, I'm sorry.
what kind of, I'm going to paraphrase, you can tell me if this is right. What kind of legislation needs to happen to deal with runoff from farming that may have water quality impediments in it, like nitrates? Is that more or less right?
Yes. What kind of legislation can be passed that can ensure like balance between both focusing on getting getting water for farming while also preserving the ecosystem? So regulating what chemicals come from farming runoff into our rivers.
Can I ask for a lifeline from the audience? Yeah, let's do it. Where's Secretary Ross? There we go. All right.
There's regulations now.
Good.
Now, the Irrigated Ag Lands program at the State Water Resources Control Board is all about being able to mitigate that. It's really focused on nitrogen runoff as well as what's going into the groundwater and preventing that. But before that, there were programs before that on just sediment and other types of things. But Cindy Tuck probably has an even better answer than I do. I just want you to know that I'm about, for every law that passes, we have to take 10 off the books because there's so many already. I just wanted to put that plug in. I know.
All right, thank you so much for that question. Who else is out there? Okay, Sal, who have you got there?
Hello, I'm Regan, and I was going to ask, what do you think, how did this affect even beyond like aquatic animals? All the different changes to the water systems, how could that affect just different on-land ecosystems?
I couldn't quite hear the full question. Did you guys? What's the effect on land ecosystems?
Different land ecosystems and wildlife, how could that, like all the different changes to water, how could that affect them?
Wildlife? Talking about the effect on wildlife?
Can you paraphrase, Sal? Because we can't hear from here.
Yeah, I think the effect of water on wildlife in California, I believe,
Okay,
and
so-
water policy.
Got it. Thank you.
So I'll start, and anyone else? I think one of our enduring challenges in California is how to make sure that we get water to our refuges that support the Pacific Flyway, and how we think about warming temperatures and drying conditions and their effect on those systems, and our ability to make sure that when we are allocating water for lots of different beneficial uses, including bird and mammal species that use our landscape and need water available to them. I think a lot of our solutions are, especially in the Sacramento Valley, and I know Willie can speak to this much more granularly than I can, but the work that we're doing to understand more fully working landscapes and water on working landscapes, it's really changing the way we think about the role of agriculture in providing appropriate habitat for wildlife as well, and water plays a significant part in that. How that fits with the need that we have, and this is probably your bailiwick, but how that fits with certain kinds of crop rotation, particularly, again, in the Sacramento Valley. Lots of opportunities to proactively and intentionally maintain that kind of working landscape when we think about where and when we apply water on these landscapes. But
I'm going to jump in with one thought before Willie.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that question, which might have been from another future water leader in the room. So thank you for speaking up. What I would say, as I'm trained as a wetland ecologist, is that every time we implement nature-based solutions that are well designed, so we're implementing something on the ground to protect us from climate change, like maybe it's a new floodplain that's going to help reduce flooding in a city downstream. But if we design it in a way that it creates a wetland that works, all the other animals that live nearby are going to come and use that wetland. And when we have water-wise gardens that use native California species, that's really going to be helpful for our native wildlife. So it's really all the decisions we make around water that create viable habitat. All of our wet habitats are pretty much the most valuable ones for all the other wildlife as well. Like grizzly bears, we don't think of them as aquatic, but they like to come and eat salmon. So thank you for that question. I'm going to turn it back over to Willie.
Yeah, so I think the question was related to what are the, I'm just going to make it really simple, what are the impacts of water management on both aquatic and terrestrial species? I know it's not exactly what it was, but that's the question I'm going to address here. So look, I said it earlier and I'll say it again, we have impacted all of our watersheds for almost 200 years. We have changed our watersheds, whether it's the headwaters, whether it's the floodplain, construction of reservoirs and dams and diversions. If you want to talk about leadership, water managers in California absolutely have to be leaders. They are leaders. They're inherently leaders because there's nothing to look to anymore of what the baseline is anymore. The baseline went away in, let's call it 1800. We don't know what nature would have evolved to. We don't have a parallel to compare to. So what we need to do is we need to look at impacts, both positive and negative. I mean, when we construct a project, even the projects we constructed post-World War II in the big kind of development boom, leaders back then were looking at benefits to cold water pools created by reservoirs, to let's talk about like Karla mentioned the flyway and the duck habitat, when you put water on a rice field to decompose rice stubble versus just burning it, open burning it. So we need to continue to do that. I know I mentioned it earlier, we need to look at it through a different lens, but we need to look at both the positive and as well as mitigating the negative impacts that we have as water managers. And we just need to acknowledge that we have nothing else to compare it to. We need to be the ones looking for these opportunities. We need to be the ones putting very diverse projects forward that are creative and getting the most out of the water that we actually use and that we actually release from our reservoirs for temperature, for water use, for irrigation, whatever it might be. We need to be smart about it. We need to take a holistic look at every positive and negative impact.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, I have a question right here from online, I think.
This is an online question coming from Douglas Deach, and he is asking about sea level rise. And there have been a lot of, in 2014, there was a video about sort of what 1 foot of sea level rise would do to the Central Valley flood and food and water supply in the Delta. In 2050, what's your answer to that question about 1 foot of sea level rise? What's happening in the Delta?
What's happening in the Delta? True to form, I'm going to tell you that for the State Water Project, we have an alternative conveyance system, and it is fully functional and delivering water. But we also have urban water users, because there's lots of folks besides the State Water Project that draw their primary supply from the estuary. And so those entities also have alternative supplies. If you're in Contra Costa County, or if you're the city of Antioch and you're now desalinating your supply, that's what we're doing. And we are reintroducing, I'm kind of looking at Jeff because he's gleeful about this, but we are essentially reintroducing how salinity moves through the system. Because remember, it's always been a tidal system, and before we decided to keep it fresh with the way that we interrupt, how fresh water moves in California, it fluctuated more significantly in terms of salinity, and those conditions will need to return in 2050. They will have returned in 2050, but we will have addressed the water supply problem. We will have done, again, significant physical restoration of the sinking islands in the Delta. That will also affect the tidal prism in the Delta in a way that will be helpful for species. I personally would like to see certain communities in particular really if we do dramatic things like elevate some of those communities, how do we think about what kind of the next generation of flood protection is in an area that is so vulnerable to catastrophic levee failure? And how do we make sure those communities aren't constantly in the way of that potential? And there are, potentially other solutions that enable us if, communities like Hood or other places, getting those communities elevated, because we know over time there's going to be more flood risk and more potential for catastrophic damage.
All right, vision for 2050. I think we have time for one last question. It might be a quicker answer. Sal, is that you? Okay.
I'm currently working in the private sector, and we're concerned with climate change, and we are working on DAC technology, or carbon capturing technology. And what we're finding, it takes a huge amount of fresh water. And so we're curious, is this government water agencies working on coming up with a plan to help companies like my own to help implement the DAC technology or carbon capturing technology?
Any thoughts on direct carbon capture?
I mentioned earlier that, climate change, something in it for everyone. I think that there's if your company could somehow, I don't know what huge amounts of water are, but I'll just say if there's a way that you can store water at a facility that's captured during times of surplus, there'll be opportunities to do that in the future. We talked about intense floods in the future. That's going to be a thing. More intense floods in the future. If we can get some of that water into storage somehow at your facility, I would absolutely look at that. If that's not feasible, there's I don't know where your private business is, but there's all types of different water forums to just get educated on. I mentioned earlier that every watershed's different. It's really every water system's different. Every community's water supply is different. I think understanding where your community, the current condition of your community's water supply, it is at a baseline level, is a great place to start, and then you can look for opportunities there to, get the water that you might need for your business, whatever the use is. And I'm glad to hear there's people looking at carbon capture.
All right, Sarah's got one quick question for us.
This question comes from Liza Gross of Inside Climate News, and she says, Letitia Grenier said underfunding has constrained California climate preparation. How has voter approval of Prop 4 affected the panel's view of California's ability to prepare for a rapidly warming future?
Oh, great. So looking back from 2050, how important was Prop 4 that just got passed?
You're looking at me?
I'm looking at all of you. Who's looking at me? Go for it.
I think it's a good start and got us ignited on a path, but there's a whole lot more we have to do, like orders of magnitude more needs to be done. So there, again, I think a good start in terms of some of the land transition planning, some of the nature-based solutions work, especially on flood. But, my view is I wish we had a whole lot more going on in there for water, just to be totally candid. So that's a little hard question for me to answer.
All right, next time, more in the water bond.
I'll add to that. And
all right, we got to wrap up, though. Quick one.
It'll be quick. She's inferring that I take a long time to answer questions. Okay. I agree with Karla, but we're going in the right direction. I'm glad it passed. It just tells you, like in the forest scenario, society realizes we need to manage our forests. We've had catastrophic forest fires. I think society realizes we need to invest in our water systems or whatever it is. And so, yeah, at least we're going in the right direction, and it passed.
Thank you so much.
Is that quick enough?
That was good. That's good. How about a big round of applause for our wonderful panel? Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you in the audience online and in the room for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here and getting to chat with you and hear from you. We hope you can hang around to network. We have this space for a while so we can talk and dream up more ideas for the next water bond or whatever. Also, as Jeff mentioned earlier, you're going to receive an email later today with a survey about how this event went and was it useful. We really look at what you write down. Several of us read every word, so please share your thoughts with us. It'll help us do a better job next time. And have a wonderful day. It's going to be 2024 again when I snap.